one of Australia's very few professional shakuhachi players. Anne trained in both Australia and Japan and has performed all over the world. She is also a tea aficionado and wrote a book called Camellia Cha. Anne has a gig coming up in the Boit in Box Hill in May, and other performers who play traditional Japanese instruments will be there. Welcome, Anne.
I just read this book. It's got very powerful words. This is my response. I don't know what I'm going to play, but this is my response.
I would now love to welcome Emeritus Professor Gillian Triggs. For the past 5 years she was President of the Australian Human Rights Commission and has now returned to the University of Melbourne, where she is working in the Faculty of Law. Professor Triggs has stood up for human rights in Australia at a most difficult time. It is a great honour here to have her here tonight. Welcome, Gillian.
It's a huge pleasure to be here amongst such wonderful company and in such a wonderful place. I'm not a great reader of poetry, but I'm very bookish, and I love all these books and the obituaries and the photographs and the memorabilia is just wonderful to see. And I'm rather sorry to learn, having just discovered it, that it'll be closing later in the year, but it's a wonderful, wonderful institution, and so nice to be with poets to celebrate this wonderful book by Di Cousens. Thank you very much, Di, for inviting me to speak to the book, say a little bit about it. And my first impression really is that Diana has a very special talent because she's achieved what lawyers can really not achieve, and that is she has used the miracle of language to crystallize the horror of the social injustices that we see. And I can speak for hours, I won't tonight, but I can speak for hours in lecturing about human rights law, or about my experiences on Christmas Island, or about the cases and, in my view, the disappointing approaches by the High Court, about the way the legislation's been crafted or distorted. But I could never, ever reach the hearts and minds of people with such beautiful, without this poetry. So it really achieved something that my profession doesn't usually achieve. I don't know how many lawyer poets there are, but I don't think there are terribly many. But Di, it is wonderful. Thank you for thinking about this, and really giving us the strong sense of social justice that you have, tinged, I think, more with a quiet sadness than with rage, but I'm going to come back to rage a little bit later. But your poems cover an astonishing range of issues. The Adani coal mine, all contemporary, of course, the Adani coal mine and the damage that it does to the land, the death penalty and the execution of Andrew Chan and Miriam Sukumaran, the tragedy of their death really for a political purpose at a moment in time that couldn't be stopped despite the best efforts. The British atomic bomb testing at Murrulinga in South Australia in the 50s that we worked to get compensation for unsuccessfully for those suffering forms of cancer as a consequence. The arrogance of colonialists believing themselves to be the new race, forgetting what came before and ignoring that something will come after them. Homeless women living in cars, a delightful poem, but again a sad, reflective one of a reality. The poems have a longing for the past in many respects, but also, of course, the poems that deal with the last poignant weeks of your father's life and his interaction with one of the refugees that you dealt with. A recurring theme of the collection is the plight, of course, of the refugees on Manus and Nauru, the women and the children and the men who've been held in many cases for more than 4 or 5 years without any real hope of resettlement. Di has devoted much of the last 3 or 4 years to communicating with these refugees on Manus and Nauru, and she's given them at least some comfort that they haven't been forgotten by all Australians. She writes a wonderful poem called What is Not News, and it's the secrecy, for example, of a Sudanese man who, to use Di's words, has gone mad and placed in solitary. It will not be reported. But she says, I know the numbers to the secret phones, and they chose me as a witness. And it's as a witness that I understand Di's particular perspective on the horror and the inhumanity and the spitefulness of our policies in Manus and Nauru, and of course continuing in parts of Australia. The refugee poems remind us of the ripples of impact of this inhumanity, and one is the delightful but very sad picture of a 4-year-old daughter of a refugee who died on Manus. She lives in northwest Pakistan, and the book not only has wonderful poems but very poignant and beautiful pictures in it as well, each of them explained. But this little girl with all the hope in her face will never see her father again and ever understand how and why he tried to create a better life for his family but ended up on Manus and dying. There's a wonderful poem that I think is going to be read this evening, the Good Friday shooting on Manus. Di wasn't there to see those injustices, but she reports the fear that she remembers from being on the phone when one of the attacks started. And she said, I carry the moment I thought they would die. But one of the things that I found interesting about that particular poem is that Di recognises that this is a very complex situation for the Manusians on the island. And she, in the poem, crystallises the idea that they've grown tired of refugees as their vegetables in the supermarkets become more expensive, as the promise of jobs and contracts fail to materialise, and the initial perhaps bewilderment and bemusement became anger and disappointment and horror. The poems, of course, remind me very much of my many detention visits to centres in Australia and in Christmas Island. I was not permitted to go to Manus or Nauru, as the government has persistently maintained that they are sovereign nations and that they will decide for themselves whom they allow at $10,000 a minimum a go for a visa, who they will allow to go. But in any event, our own government refused to allow me to go. But I have seen the misery of Villawood, and there's a poem about Villawood. And I think one point that I think was important to me, and I think is reflected in the poems, is I've been to Villawood many, many times. It's about an hour and a half's drive out of Sydney. It's a concentration camp. It's a prison. It's a very, very unpleasant place. And she describes just getting in there, the guns, the wire, I think you were given some sort of indication on your hands that you'd been through. I remember going to Christmas Island, in fact, after Villawood, and we had our passports, and the guard at one of the entrances to the parts of Christmas Island that I was visiting wanted my passport, and I refused to give it to him. And he wanted my phone, and I refused to give it to me. And I had my staff behind me, a group of about 5 or 6 people, and they were saying, look, give him the passport, they want the passport. And I said, I refuse to give him the passport. That is my identity. They've stripped the identity of all of these people on this island, denied them basic rights and basic respect for their humanity. I'm not giving him my passport. That is important. And I thought, well, they would just toss me off the island. I would be back on the next plane. But I think he was frightened by my absolute determination, and I was sort of waved through as if, well, you're a wretched nuisance, so just go on through and deal with it. But again, one of the poems deals with this, the indignity. But to come back to Villawood again, I think it's very little known there that many of the people in what's known as Blacksland, it's the high security part of Villawood, is a lot of New Zealanders whose visas have been cancelled on character grounds. They've not had any criminal charge against them. They've not had any day in court, obviously important to a lawyer, important to everybody, no natural justice at the most minimal level. But they've failed the character test as determined by the minister at the minister's discretion, which is neither compellable. If you wanted him to exercise it, he may or may not, and it's always he, may or may not exercise it, and having exercised it, it is not subject to judicial review, because the discretion you can't examine a discretion by law. He exercises the discretion. Unless there's something manifestly wrong, like a conflict of interest or something of that kind, you really can't get judicial review. But I knew all of this, but what really struck me when I got to Blacksland was the racial impact, because we think of New Zealanders as being like most of us. These are not those kinds of New Zealanders. They're Pacific Islanders. They are 6'6", they're huge men, and there are 6 to a tiny room in bunks, and they're like caged animals pacing up and down in a concrete compound, and they've been there for years. The inhumanity and the spitefulness of the lives that they lead is beyond description, and it's very, as I say, it's very interesting. A lawyer trying to explain the facts and the law, but somehow a poem can get the inhumanity, but also the spitefulness of it across at a level that perhaps has a powerful sense. And you talk of 3 locked doors, I thought was a wonderful phrase. It is many, many locked doors clanking behind you like a bad American B-grade movie. But it's all true. And I remember leaving Villawood one day, it had been my 3rd or 4th visit, and I just missed the train. I don't know whether any of you have ever been to Villawood Station, but it's a bleak concrete station a long way out of Sydney. And in their inimitable wisdom, they have locked the lavatories. So I had about a 50-minute wait for the next train at about 7:30 at night in the cold and the rain. And I was filled with guilt, because I knew that after 3 days there, I was leaving and I was going home to my comfortable flat and a gin and tonic and a discussion with my husband. But the misery of it was overwhelming, mixed with the guilt that I was leaving these people there. And there was really almost nothing that I could do for them. I could report it, and the minister would table my reports with the words in Parliament, as he must statutorily table my reports. He tables them with the words, "I table this report." There's no name, there's no topic, there's no substance that you would ever gather. It's simply table, and it sinks like a stone. It was very, very frustrating and a very, very difficult environment to be in. Another illustration of the frustration that one can have in dealing with this kind of work was Yonge Hill. I'd be interested, does anyone here know where Yonge Hill is?
Outside of Perth?
Yes, but very, very few. One or two in an audience will know where it is. It's about 2 hours drive out of Perth. It's a high security criminal prison. It's recently been built at many millions, and there are about 350 men there. Some of them asylum seeker refugees, others who've lost their visas on character grounds. And they are virtually unknown. We talk about Manus, we talk about Nauru, we talk about Christmas Island, where there are now another 350. 140 children on Nauru, although the government, of course, denies it, saying that they're not detained, they're free to be on the island. These men are completely unknown. Nobody knows about them, nobody discusses them, the media never goes, the stories are never told. And one of the things that most concerns the men there is their ranking as high, medium or low security risks, because it affects what privileges they might have, few as they might be, whether they go to the dentist in manacles or whether they can go without them, would depend on how they ranked as high, medium or low security. And I said to the superintendent after a couple of days there, this is obviously a matter of concern to these men. They're separated from their families, they have no hope for the future, but the thing they're mostly complaining about is that they object to being ranked as high security when there's really no objective basis for doing it. So I said, how do you determine this high security, low, medium security ranking? And the superintendent said, oh, you don't have to worry about that, it's done with an algorithm. And that filled me with despair, because you cannot reason with somebody like this. Somebody did argue with me, in fact, and say, well, an algorithm's fairer than a subjective judgment. It might be, I don't know, it depends on what you put into the algorithm to see what you're going to get out of it. But one can speak at very, very high theoretical levels about the detention of asylum seekers and refugees and loss of visas and 19,000 people in the community whose claims to refugee status have yet to be assessed in Australia. And there's some quite complex law there. But somehow it was the small, spiteful things that most affected me. The women on Christmas Island who had to queue in the sun because their children had used up more than the 3 allocated nappies. Somebody who was sick wasn't allowed to bring their food back from the canteen to the shipping containers that had been designed to keep them for years and years without education. So that really, really affected me, I think, in a way, more than the sort of more theoretical position at law. One of the things that I think is important about this book and why one should read it and enjoy the pictures is that it is these crystallized words, but also the pictures that can be important in moving community thoughts. Just by way of example, some 3 years or so ago, I had reported on the use of steel restraints and spit hoods for juveniles in detention in the Northern Territory. In one documented case, the steel restraints used 16 times, and the young man in question detained in isolation for 16 hours a day as a 16-year-old. And I had reported to Parliament this report had sunk without trace. But then a couple of years later, we all watched the Four Corners report, and you saw that CCTV footage on the Four Corners report and that iconic image of the Dylan Voller, a troubled young man, as we've seen from subsequent behaviour, but a troubled man, a young man from the earliest of times, in the still restraint with the hood. Within hours, the Prime Minister was on the phone to me asking whether or not we should have a royal commission into the detention of youths. Now, of course, the answer is yes, and I'm sure he consulted lots and lots of other people. But the point is that that is what you need to change. Something has to be almost cataclysmic, something of a horrifying level that's in the public image in a way that's accessible, that finally moves the hearts and minds. For my generation, in the Vietnam War, here in Melbourne, was, I'm sure you all know, that image of the 9-year-old girl running down the street from the napalm bombing. Relatively recently, in another poem by Dai, you make the allusion, I think, to Alain, the little 4-year-old who was found on the beach in Turkey. And you make something I hadn't noticed before. You talk about his the small child floated to the shore, his tiny shoes. I hadn't noticed that. But that the shape of his body has now, of course, become the image that I think Guy Weiwei has picked up in his art. But this is almost what we need to grapple with the dimensions of the cruelty and the inhumanity of some of these policies, and I think that Di does this wonderfully in her poems. She does, as I said earlier, deal with wider social issues, and one that particularly affected me was the car woman. And the picture of the car, I assumed that was...
That's the real car.
That was the real car. I assumed that it was. There's something very authentic about this book. But we know at the Australian Human Rights Commission, I shouldn't use we, I'm not with them anymore, but an astonishing phenomenon is that the fastest growing group of homelessness people in Australia is women over 55. And they're not 18-year-olds sleeping under a bridge that's much more visible, or they're not on Flinders Street station, but they are couch surfing. They're ringing the son to see if they can spend a few weeks with him, and then the daughter, and then an aunt. And they're impoverished in an environment in which they have worked in one way or another all of their lives, but are left with poverty and indignity, and have somehow or another to survive. And I think this poem in particular was very powerful in making that story. So these are lovely poems, but they are quiet and reflective, measured and sad. But I'd really like to speak to you about incandescent rage. I think we need to think a little differently about this, or in addition to what I finished the book very angry. Now, I'm sure if there's a psychologist here, you'll say anger is not a great emotion. It needs to be tempered and measured. But I think we've reached a stage on so many of these issues where Australia is regressing, and we have regressed ever since that monumental year that I was just speaking to friends here about, that year 2001. And you'll remember it began about the middle of the year with the children overboard lie. Nearly 12 months later, a Senate inquiry found there was no evidence whatsoever for the suggestion that typically Muslim asylum seekers had thrown their children overboard in order to ensure that their children were picked up and they would have the benefit of Australian jurisdiction and ultimately Australian protection. That was a lie, but you'll remember that the election was 2 weeks later, and I understand that there is evidence to suggest that that was the cincher, in a way, for the Howard win. In other words, one of the problems we have to deal with in this post-truth world is this extraordinary tolerance for inaccuracy, for misspeaking, for alternative facts or false news. But from that moment, within a few months, we had the Tampa incident of that extraordinary Norwegian ship's captain who sailed the Tampa into Australian waters contrary to the direction from government on the basis of a basic principle of search and rescue on the seas. And then the interesting decision by Justice North in the federal court. But within weeks of that, we had the 9/11 terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And I think if you can ever date things in history, I think that's a year when we can say Australia went from being a pretty good international citizen. We had a great tradition in Australia from Doc Everett and even further back to Jesse Street, right up to the 90s. But from 2001, I think we've seen a retreat on so many issues. Certainly women and economic empowerment or disempowerment, asylum seeker, refugee treatment, which breaches just about every fundamental principle of international law and refugee that you would care to think about. There is even an explicit provision in our Migration Act now that if the return of a refugee to a place of danger as a consequence of a decision to deport someone, that is not a basis for declining to deport them. In other words, there's an express provision in the Migration Act in breach of the Refugees Convention, which of course is not part of Australian law. So there's been, and I don't want to go too much further than the poems because they are really what we're here to celebrate tonight, but I think we need to use a certain rage to think about where we go to from here, how we've allowed Australia to regress in the way that we have. And one of the things that I think we have to talk about is whether we should think about a Charter of Rights for Australia. We're the only democracy in the world without one, the only common law country in the world without a Charter of Rights. And had we that charter, it would be possible for the High Court to protect some of these rights. And I think that's something that we need to think about and use a little bit of the rage to move this issue forward, because as we speak, there are about 600 men on Manus. There are about 1,300 men in Australian detention centres and Christmas Island, and about 350 people on Nauru, having been there for 4 or 5 years, living in tents, and 140 children. 30 of them in formal detention, the rest living on the island. And this, so I think you do, again, Di, mention in your poems, I think in your foreword, that you've written the letters, you're a member of PEN, you've done everything you can do, and we're not shifting this. We're not shifting public opinion, partly because, of course, both major parties support these policies. But somehow we have to speak out for the inhumanity, whether with poetic sadness like you or incandescent rage like me. We have got to do something to bring Australia back to the values on which this society was built. So in conclusion, can I say what a privilege it's been for me to know Di and to have the chance to read this and to speak about her poems and to speak in such a wonderful environment. So thank you all very much, and do buy the book.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's really important to balance those things, kindness, embracement, but also maintain the rage. Yes. I would like to invite Arnold Zabel to read the first poem. Good Friday, Shooting on Manus Island. Arnold is a much-loved author of many books, and he is also a passionate advocate for refugees. A past president of the writers' organisation, PEN, he has worked hard for writers in prison all over the world for many years. Welcome, Arnold.
Thank you very much. Di has put a note on this chair to Beirut Buchani. It's a PEN tradition to have an empty chair for someone who can't be present because they are imprisoned and Beirut remains imprisoned. When it comes to character tests, Gillian, I don't think our minister would pass one for human decency. I think summing up in just one way this collection is to go back to the Tampere incident actually, and with express orders from Canberra, no journalist and no photographer was allowed near that boat, and all you saw was a red hull off Christmas Island, and you saw telephoto lens photographs, and so you saw a horde of people. You saw people being demonised, and a horde inspires fear. And I think that Di's poems are the opposite. They are the close-up lens to human beings. And it's a real honour to read this poem. I think it's an extraordinary poem. I think it's a poem that's going to live on. I think it's a poem that we'll see in years to come and read it, and it encapsulates something in a very, very powerful way. Good Friday shooting on Manus Island, 2017. I wasn't there when the refugees were kidnapped by Australia's Immigration Department. I wasn't there when Australia built a detention centre beside a naval base squatting like colonists on Manus Island. I wasn't there when the expert panel decided that transportation to Pacific Islands would be an effective way of stopping the boats. I wasn't there to watch the Minusians grow tired of the refugees, see their vegetables become expensive, their soccer pitch occupied by foreigners. I wasn't there when a man was killed in the night and 2 locals were charged and convicted, and 2 white men who joined in the killing were sent back to Australia and not charged for their crimes. I wasn't there when a local barmaid was gang raped by Australian staff who went home and escaped the jurisdiction. I wasn't there when the great tradition was invented that white men are not subject to black men's courts. I wasn't there when Australia handed over dollars in brown paper bags to Papuan politicians who were paid to turn tricks. I wasn't there on Good Friday when the refugees and PNG sailors got into a fight about soccer, whose turn it was to play footy, and the game was suddenly over. But I was there on the phone in the night when drunken sailors came back with their guns, stalking and shooting from outside the fence, the bullets going through walls and doors, men lying low on their beds or running in circles with nowhere to hide. I was listening to the running, the shouting, Farsi and English, the chaos and fear that this was the end. I was there for the farewell from the war zone. And though the sailors stopped shooting and no one was killed, I carry the moment. I thought they would die.
Lovely. So, I would like to now invite the author of the book, Cousens, to come up and read some poems for us. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
And I hope it maybe changes things one day down the track.
And thank you everyone for coming. It's a great thrill to see everybody here. And especially I'm deeply grateful to Professor Gillian Triggs for her wonderful speech launching the book, and Arnold for
Yay, Gillian.
and for all your work over those years, giving us hope, you know, and for Arnold reading that poem just then, maintaining the rage. Thank you for that. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past and present. The empty chair is for Behrouz Boochani, a Kurdish-Iranian writer imprisoned on Manus Island. So there's this, so I'll put it a little more obviously. This is for Behrouz. This is a very exciting occasion for me, and I am incredibly grateful to all those who've made it possible. I'd like to first thank my launcher, the extraordinary Professor Gillian Triggs. You've given everyone hope that the idea of human rights and standards have a value and cannot be forgotten. We are all in awe of your courage in standing up to the politicians in Canberra. And I'd also like to thank Arnold again. Anyway, this book would not exist without my dear friend Julie Catlin, who is the designer. Now, where's Julie? Yes, over in the back. She's wonderful. So my sincerest thanks to her for her unstinting collaboration over the past 26 years. And of course I have to thank Chris and Retta, who are the owners of Collected Works. For years they have supported all the poets of... Yay! For years they have supported all the poets of Melbourne and made available all of the poetry in the world. It is a real good fortune to be able to have the launch here before the shop closes at the end of the year. And I'd also like to thank Anne Norman, our shakuhachi player. What an amazing thing just to compose on the spot in response to the book. Thank you for that.
I read all the poems, but it was that one, and my feeling was I wasn't there. I was there. That was for me.
Yeah.
What I was responding to.
Right. Thank you. Yes. Well, it was very dramatic to be there. As has been mentioned, many of the poems in this small book are about refugees. Many of them have come out of my friendship with people on Manus Island. I have to also thank the refugees for trusting me with their stories and for sharing their thoughts and feelings during their still ongoing imprisonment. The most intense period of contact was up to May 2016, before the Papua New Guinean government declared the imprisonment on Manus Island illegal, because no one had committed a crime. And in PNG, it is illegal to imprison people who have committed no crime. Now that's what having a human rights law enables, and we don't have that. But they do amazingly in PNG. Until then, we communicated by secret phones, and the refugees were often bashed by guards when they were found with phones. But they kept them so as to stay in contact with their families and with lawyers and advocates outside. But it was a very dangerous thing to have a phone and to be in fear of being bashed. And anyway, I was up quite late, and then a buddy from work, Penny. Where's Penny? Well, there you are. So she would see me the next day after being up all night on the phone and say, "Don, what's happened to you?" Well, I didn't sleep a lot for some time, but anyway, that's since things have changed, and I'm not doing that now. Now, there is a word bystander, which is when you watch but do not act. I went from being a bystander to being a witness and then to being an advocate. Painfully, I have learned that writing to members of Parliament and having petitions tabled has not brought these people freedom. Our system is broken. We need a Bill of Rights and guarantees of basic principles so that no one can be detained without cause. But before, during and still I am a poet, and so all of the different experiences of my life turn up in my poems. There are also many poems here on other topics. So I will read a few poems, but before that I'd also like to thank a few other friends such as Judith Rodriguez, Janet Galbraith, and someone who unfortunately also can't be here, Michael Gordon, the Age journalist, who was always listening and interested in the information that I could send him from Manus Island, but who unfortunately died earlier this year. Anyway, so to the poems. So, I might start with visiting Villawood. Now, this is kind of the banality of evil, you know, and it's actually become much worse in the last year. They've implemented a lot more regulations, and so what I'm saying now is like, oh, that was the happy time, you know. Now it's much, much harder. They can't get presents and have food brought in the way that was possible then. There are no photos because my camera and his phone were taken away, but I will remember him and he will remember me. The guard marks my arm with a pen with invisible ink. I am given a numbered wristband. I have the name of the refugee prisoner. We have exchanged messages, but this is our first meeting. When he realizes I am the one who sent him a poetry book, I am hugged. Outside, we share a picnic of bread, tomatoes, olives, and hummus. It is cold. I pull my jacket and scarf closer. My new friend has no country. He is Kurdish. We are behind a high fence, supervised by crows. Gates slam and guards wander. Watch from the other side. We share life stories. I was 10 years in university. He used to work with his hands, learnt to read in stolen moments from someone kind. He is not a famous writer, but I repeat the pen message written on New Year cards each December. There are people outside who know you are inside. We hope for your release. I say, I know this is wrong. After 2 hours, it is cold. I go back through the locked gates and collect my bags. The guard takes the wristband. I carry an invisible mark. So that was... that was the first poem that I wrote after, meeting refugees. I did write a poem about Reza Barati, which is in the free text space. I've got my previous books here for sale as well. So if anyone's interested in the earlier books, they're on the table and they're $10. Now, after that, I became friends, communicating, as I said, in the night, talking to people. And Gillian mentioned this poem, What is Not News? You will not hear about the South Sudanese man now gone mad and placed in solitary, because it will not be reported. You will not see the photos of the Iranian man with long, deep cuts to his arms, who has stabbed himself in the chest, because the photos will not be published. You will not wake at night to news that your friend was finally allowed to go to the memorial service for his fellow Kurd dead on Christmas Island after repeated bashings from guards. You will not wait days for news that the nail cutter was finally excreted by the Afghani man who swallowed it while the hospital did nothing. You will not see or hear or know what is going on in Manus Island, because it is a black site, a secret place, and the news cannot get out. But I know, because they gave me the numbers to the secret phones and they chose me as a witness. So there's a slightly happier side to the relationships as well. We become friends, and we share common interests, and so in amongst all the gloom, we somehow make these connections. So this poem is actually about my dad. My dad had a lot of different illnesses, and he was in a nursing home for many years. So it's called Intersection. In the end, I am the only visitor. My father lies in bed after dinner, his face to the wall, not knowing where he is or how he got there. I give him chocolate and biscuits, tell him my news, though he can't understand what I'm saying sometimes. His hearing was always bad. I text my friend again, send a photo. He is in a prison camp in Papua New Guinea, a refugee. The friend asks me to say hello from him, even if my father forgets it. I say hello from my friend, but it's a bit hard to explain when all the rest of his life is gone. There's a guy in a jungle who can see his photo and who sends his best regards. My father worked in radio. He knows about recording voice. This telephone can record your voice, I say. There is a man in a jungle who wants to say hello, and this time he understands. The dining room of the nursing home is beige, and the framed prints of cheery landscapes are faded by the sun. He speaks into the microphone. I press send, and on Manus Island my refugee responds. I play back his voice. The messages go back and forth. My father tells the refugee he is proud to know him. We sit at a square table with some old people who look but don't speak. Dad is 90. He has one more fortnight. So this is my poem. It was the 50th anniversary of the nuclear tests at Maralinga, South Australia, a year ago or so, and I wrote this one. Maralinga Nuclear Test Site, South Australia. Green glass ground, sand burnt by the bomb, Maralinga, poisoned air, evaporated people, no animals, empty spaces, a past that stopped, silent songs sung by the missing. I might read this poem about the car woman. She was parked out. I was working at RMIT, and she was parked in Cardigan Street outside the Art and Design Library for about a week. And anyway, there we are. So as Gillian mentioned, there's a photo. That's the car. Car woman. I saw the woman who lives in a car today. She was probably 60 years old, short light brown hair, glasses, clothes of no colour. She sat in the front seat and was reading the paper. The seat beside her and the back seat are full of things. Some books, borrowed from the university library, and a disability parking permit are on the dashboard. On the seats, back and front, there is stuff. I don't know what it is. It looks like no one has dug all the way to the bottom in a long time. There are large boxes wrapped in plastic on the roof rack too. Just enough space in the front for her to sit and hold the wheel and press the pedals. Every other corner is full up. The car's been there a few days. Small red with battered sides of different colours and a national flag stuck in the rack. It's a shame when the country lets people fall through the cracks. One day I guess she'll be found, still in the front seat but no longer breathing. And the rest of us will look at the car and say, and just why were you waving that flag? I'll probably just read one more poem because it's probably been quite a long event already. But this one, so the title of the book, The Days Pass Without Name, it comes from living in India. And a year ago I went back to India to see a friend of mine who's been living there for 40 years. She's from Finland and she's also a poet. So she's had a dedicated religious life. Anyway, so it was lovely just to be back in India. So, what day is it? I have worked out it must be Wednesday, but the days pass without name. A fan rattles the heat, and an open door brings the sound of metal pots washed in buckets. A call to Allah cuts through the darkness. Dawn will come. The peacocks have not yet come to wake me, but it is hot this morning and I am already awake. Yesterday on the tour around the mountain, we found all of the wells and washing places dry. The monsoon did not come in November. What will the animals do? They have no town taps. The mountain is harder to see now. New buildings block the view. Commerce lines the road. My friend and I are nostalgic for the old days, the quiet road, the clear view of the mountain arising out of the Indian plain. So, thank you for coming. It's been wonderful, and I'm really thrilled to have so many friends here. It's really fantastic. Julie.
Maybe haven't been thinking deeply about enough, and maybe we should share that deep thinking.
That is another point. Well done. Yes.
There we go.